we want to optimize arousal and control anxiety and measure anxiety in sport. So we're talking about how do we measure anxiety? How do we get people's arousal increased? Because arousal for sports people is a good thing. It gets you up for the game, but anxiety is a negative thing, and there's your broad difference between arousal and anxiety. Have a watch of that video. So youtube.com/watch V equals 8ZKTPOSDZ31. You'll get a quick idea of an example of sports people choking. This is essentially a table tennis player talking about how he choked at the Olympics in the final. So, as an introduction, if you take part in sport yourself, you'll experience good and bad performances. So just like being a full-time student, there are some days where you feel in the zone and everything's going smoothly, but other times where nothing goes as planned and your nerves get the better of you. So like in formal tests or exams, and the example that I use is when you used to have to read out loud in English. If I'd have been reading that out loud in English when I was at high school, I would have stumbled across almost every word, even though when I'm not thinking about it like now, I can just zip through it. At elite levels of sport, there is often very little difference in skill. So it's because I was extremely anxious in that class about looking stupid because I'd fluffed my lines up once or twice. And they say that's where speech impediments come from as well, actually, is getting your words wrong once or twice and feeling foolish or someone mocking you, and then you stick with it. So it is anxiety that's causing it. So most crucial separating factor of any athlete is the ability to control the arousal and reduce the anxiety. So controlling the arousal doesn't mean necessarily keeping it low. It would be trying to keep arousal at an optimal level. So not too high, but certainly not too low. And reducing anxiety. So thinking about how that works in a game, for example, you've got situational demands. So what is it of the situation? For example, is it a really important match? Is it a cup final where England are about to take penalties and are all going to crumble and fire it over the bar because it's a huge pressure situation? So situational demands first, and then the athlete's perception of the cognitive demands. So positive demands, so your perception in your brain, so your thought processes, could be, I see this as challenging, I see this as a challenge to rise to. Or it can be negative, and you can go, oh no, it's a massively important match, I'm really scared. And the best managers in football, for example, are going to get their players to see this as a big challenge of their career where they can show off and they can really put themselves as some of the best players in the world, rather than managers that go, right, if you don't do well at this, then you're sacked. So that's the cognitive aspect. Then you've got the fact that you get the increased arousal or physiological. So positive physiological, so biological arousal is known as eustress. Compared to negative is distress, and we've heard of distress, we all know what that is. So you want that arousal in terms of your physiological responses to be eustress rather than distress. And then as a result of that, whether you've gone positive, eustress, you're going to have a positive enhanced performance, this is the outcome, or it was negative and threatening, it was negative distress, and therefore you have impaired performance. So you can see in these two boxes, I'm going to kill you. One's thinking, the other's thinking you're going to kill me. This one's already at a disadvantage if they're thinking that cognitively, which causes them distress, which is probably going to lead to impaired performance. Key terms then. So we've got two key terms. Arousal, which is the physiological somatic. Now, somatic is a word there that might be new to you. That is your actual physiological response. So whenever we refer to somatic within this topic, it is about your body's reaction, which is fight or flight. So in an evolutionary sense, that's basically you run away for the flight, or you fight, you stand and you fight. But the biological reaction are things like adrenaline, increased blood pressure, increased heart rate, muscle tension, shallow blood breathing, butterflies in the stomach and sweating. So those are somatic reactions. Arousal is a somatic physical reaction. How can we measure these symptoms? Just to add a couple underneath, you've got increased blood pressure. You can obviously measure blood pressure with a blood pressure monitor that you get at the doctor's. The increased heart rate is simply you can use apps for that now, but it's a heart rate monitor, or it's a pulse thing on your arm, is Apple Watch. You've got muscle tension, and muscle tension is measured by something called an EMD device, which measures your muscle tension, and it clicks. The more tense you get, the faster the clicks. The more relaxed you are, the clicks get slower, and you can measure that quantitatively of how tense someone is. Butterflies in the stomach, the only thing that we can do with that is ask people how they feel, really, isn't it? And sweating is one that you can measure with a GSR, a galvanic skin response test, and it's something that measures conductance of how sweaty your palms are, the amount of electrical activity that passes from two points over the palm. Stress, on the other hand, is the mismatch between, so we can think of stress as anxiety. It's the mismatch between what the situation demands of you and your ability to cope. Now, if you use that example I was given of reading in English, the demands of the situation was that I read out in front of 30 boys, mainly, who were going to bully me later. And the ability of an individual to cope, it wasn't my ability to read. I was a very good reader. It was my individual ability to cope with the situation. And that's where some AO2 can come in. How do we get sports performers to perform better? Well, we train them to cope better. So we need some level of stress, that's the eustress, to help us perform better. However, if an individual perceives stress negatively, called distress, this will impair their performance. So we need a little bit of positive stress or anxiety, but we certainly don't want the negative stuff. So, first of all, drive theory. This was the one of the leading theories to begin with. Hull and Spencer's 1943, it's quite early. Drive theory, 3 major factors influencing performance. So they said the complexity of the motor task is the sport, it's the skill. So how complex is it? So, if you take an example of taking penalties, it's not that complex, that motor task. For a footballer, it isn't that tough. Whereas playing during the game might actually be much more complex, working with teammates and passing between you. So that's how the complexity of the motor task can differ. Number 2 is the levels of physiological arousal that they are experiencing. And 3 is how well they learnt the task or skill. So how well learned is it in the past? In other words, how much as a sports person practiced, what's their level of arousal in that individual game, and how complex is the thing that they're trying to do? Okay, so what they're arguing is that your performance will be a result of your arousal multiplied by your habit. The most important one is number 3, because most sports people know the complexity of their task. So how well is your habit of actually doing this thing, okay, this sport? The higher the level of physiological arousal, the more likely we are to adopt a dominant response to a situation, i.e., how have we learned to respond in a certain way? So what this argues is that we have almost an instinctive response. When we have learnt something a lot and rehearsed it a lot, then when we're faced with a situation where we have massive amounts of arousal and we almost have to revert to our automatic responses, that if we've learnt it really well, we're going to react in a really good way. So no matter how much a Winter Olympian is aroused by the fact that they're about to go down a bobsleigh and they could die, and the whole world is watching live on TV, which wouldn't usually happen to them, because they've practiced it so well, then they just revert to that automatic ability to get down that run without particularly thinking about it. So if the task is a simple one, and our dominant response is the correct one, then the higher the arousal will be associated with successful performance. Okay, so simplicity of the task, is really down to how well you've learnt it, how simple you find it. Okay, so on the other hand, if our arousal is particularly high, if I give you a different example, if you think about if you're asked to do a presentation to the whole of college, if it's the first presentation you've ever done to the whole of college, the task might be really simple. You might be a very good presenter to one person in your class. But if you then try and do that to everybody, if you try and do that to the whole school or college, that simple task suddenly, because you've not practiced it again and again and again, suddenly your presentation is dire, and you stumble over everything and you can't do it because you haven't practiced presenting to people before, or because you haven't practiced presenting. You might have gone in there thinking this is going to be really easy, I'm just going to read off the PowerPoint. But it turns out once you're in there, because you've not practiced doing it, then you don't revert back to a dominant response. The dominant response turns out to be bad presentation skills instead of someone who's an expert at it. People who've been teaching for years might be petrified by the situation. The arousal might be high, the principal might be in the room, but they can revert back to their dominant response, which is a really well-learnt one. So drive theory proposes that if you are habitually really practiced at something, more arousal isn't going to impact you. Okay, if the task is a complex one involving fine motor skills, so that can be really specific little things. I'm trying to think of sport for fine motor skills. Maybe shooting. So they sometimes have that in the Winter Olympics where they have to go on skis for a couple of hours and then they have to fall to their knees and pull out a gun and shoot a target from 100 yards away. And the arousal is through the roof and they've got fine motor skills going on. So if the task is complex, using fine motor skills, and the athlete has acquired bad habits, and the dominant response to the situation is incorrect, then the high levels of arousal will impair performance. So, again, those athletes who have practiced shooting after running for 3 hours, they're going to be fine because their response to the situation isn't going to be incorrect. But if they haven't acquired good habits, if they've got bad habits, then it's going to impair their performance. Because arousal levels are greater in a competition than in practice, and increase depending on the importance of the match, the theory predicts that the best performances of high-level athletes will take place in a high-level competition, whereas it predicts that novices are more likely to have bad habits, and they will be more likely to make mistakes under pressure. So often, when in the FA Cup, for example, a lower league team who's much less experienced, being watched on big stages on the telly, they get down to the penalty shootout, and the Premier League team ends up winning because they've done it before and they've handled the pressure before. So, yeah, the idea is drive theory. The more arousal, the more benefit to people who have done it before and who have practiced and practiced and practiced, who have good habits. So, application. Theory can explain why beginners find it difficult to perform well under pressure. However, it can also explain why experienced athletes perform better under pressure using well-learned skills. Good tennis players playing better against stronger opposition. So, Ed Moses, Olympic medal winner, the way I used to get the best out is by not expecting an easy race. It's easier when there's pressure. You get emotional and you go out and perform. But drive theory focuses on well-learned tasks cannot be applied to many sports which combine both well-learned skills and also some more complex skills that you've got to think of on the spot.